Well, the acting was stunning, I thought. I mean, wow. What a treat for us. And that guy was good looking. I don't know who he is, but what a good looking dude. Good morning. My name is Matt Stone. I'm one of the pastors here. Welcome again to worship. If you're watching online, we're glad that you've joined us as well. We're starting a new series today called Hello Neighbor. I imagine most of you recognized our attempt to recreate at least some elements of the opening montage from Mr. Rogers, which, can you believe it, August 31st, 2001. That was the date that the last episode of Mr. Rogers aired on TV. He was on air from 1968 to 2001. That's an incredible run on television. And if you have kids that grew up with Mr. Rogers, if you grew up with Mr. Rogers, then he's just a unique individual. I know there's a lot of memes and a lot of stories about how he was actually a Navy SEAL who, murdered dozens of people. Let me assure you, it's not the case. If you read his biography, which I just beg of you to do, it's beautiful, you'll find that he's actually a Presbyterian minister who just had a passion for creating content that invited children into a conversation. And he had an incredible talent for making the most complex issues accessible even to kids. And so he remains one of my heroes. I only wish I could be Mr. Rogers because he was a phenomenal influence on the world. If you're having a tough week this week, just Google some clips of Mr. Rogers and you will have a better week. I'm just telling you, you will have a better week. But the reason we're talking about Mr. Rogers is we're going to spend some time over the next couple of weeks exploring the notion of neighbor and neighborhood. And I'll start like this. Several years ago, a group of pastors from a suburb in Denver got together and they invited their mayor and a couple other civic authorities to come into a conversation. And the guiding question for the conversation was essentially, hey, we want to know, how can we best serve our city? This is what the group of pastors was asking of the mayor. How can we serve our city the best? And so they spent some time kind of naming the laundry list of challenges that they saw for the mayor. And they said, look, we see at-risk children, we see dilapidated housing, we see alcohol and substance abuse, we see isolation, we see loneliness, we see depression. And we ran through the whole gamut, right? The whole spectrum of challenges that face the community there. And then they finished their part and they waited for the mayor to respond. And the mayor said something akin to, listen, if we could, well, he said, if you want to eliminate or dramatically reduce all of these challenges that face us, there's one thing you really need to figure out. And one thing we need to figure out as a community. If we could just figure out how to be a community of great neighbors, that would be the key. And I love the response from the pastors who's reflecting afterwards. They end up writing a book called The Art of Neighboring. I'd recommend it to you. Perhaps not always the best writing, but a great story. One of the pastors is reflecting later, and he says, gosh, we were all kind of embarrassed because here this group of pastors is asking the mayor, how can we help serve the city? And the mayor essentially says, well, just do the thing that Jesus said, which was to be a good neighbor. If we could just figure out how to be good neighbors, then we could make an impact on the community around us. And the mayor goes on and he says, look, most often what happens is somebody will notice a problem in the community and they'll notice that it's getting serious and they'll approach me or they'll approach one of my colleagues and they'll say, hey, we've noticed this problem. It's getting serious. You should do something about it, right? You should create a program to address it, which in the church sounds dangerously familiar. But the mayor says, look, I don't think, and this is his opinion, I don't think government programs are going to be the most effective solution to our social issues. It's not that they can't help. However, it's limited. He says the government programs that I've witnessed are limited primarily by two things. You have a change in administration, that initiative may or may not go away. And when you have budget shortfalls, then every program becomes at risk. And the mayor further goes on to say, look, and this is in conversation with those pastors, he says, look, it's not government programs that's going to make the difference. It's relationships that will make the difference because they are organic and ongoing. When we are in relationship with our neighbors, then the shut-in is cared for not just by a government program, but by the family next door. who is not shut in and only has to walk out their front door and 50 paces to the right to serve that shut-in. And by the same token, when there's an at-risk kid in the neighborhood struggling for any one of 100 reasons, they're served not by an after-school program, or let's say not just by an after-school program, but they're served by the dad down the street who guides and mentors and helps that kid to kind of find their way. That's a beautiful idea. I love the simplicity of it, and I think there's genius in that simplicity. Like I said, they go on to write a book called The Art of Neighboring. We're going to spend a little bit of time working through that, but it's the simplicity of the notion that I think is its genius. And the truth is, the pastors who wrote the book will tell you, hey, we didn't come up with this idea, we kind of stole it from Jesus. And I just want to pull the curtain back for you for a moment and say that's what all of us do. That's what all the pastors do. We just steal our best stuff from Jesus and then hope that somebody might listen to it. So that's exactly what they've done, because they say, look, this is how Jesus and the early disciples tried to live their life. And the truth is, we see that story play out all over the Bible. This is not a one-hit wonder, right? Sometimes we're tempted to say, well, maybe that was just one verse and we don't have to take it so seriously. But the truth is, this shows up again and again and again. So last week, we spent some time talking about a guy named Mephibosheth. If you're still trying to figure out how to say it, Mephibosheth, Mephibosheth, Mephibosheth. And we spent time in 2 Samuel chapter 9 unpacking that one story. Well, this morning, we're going to look at several passages because I want you to see that it's not just a one-hit wonder passage, but from beginning to end, God reminds us, invites us, commands us over and over again to do the same thing. And I'm going to start in Matthew 22. If you have your Bibles, I'd encourage you to turn to Matthew chapter 22 because there's a great story that I imagine many of you might already be familiar. Some of you are new to the story, and I can't wait for you to hear it. But if you are familiar with this story, I want to invite you to remember that if you find yourself getting bored or tired with the things that Jesus has said, it is time to check your heart. It is time for a reset. It's okay to have heard sermons on this passage. It's okay for you to have read this passage. This is one of those passages that we cannot engage enough. It is impossible for us to look at this passage too often. So here's the story. It's in the kind of the second half of the chapter. Jesus has just kind of wiped the floor with a group called the Sadducees. They're a religious elite kind of group. They're very well educated. They believe a particular thing. They try to test Jesus. Jesus kind of sets them straight. And then it's the Pharisees' turn. They're another religious elite group, and they send one of their lawyers to kind of test Jesus. And this is how they test Jesus. In Matthew 22, in verse 36, one of their lawyers asked this question to Jesus. He says, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" And this is not coming from a place of genuine curiosity. This is coming from a place of, I want to ask you a question so that I can trap you and destroy you. That's it. Which, again, I'll say, sounds a little bit like culture right now. It turns out, 2,000 years later, we're doing the same things to each other that we've always done. So the world is not better, it's not worse, it's the same as it always has been. Somebody is trying to play out kind of a gotcha moment on Jesus. What is the greatest commandment in all the law? That's the question that they put to Jesus. Listen to how Jesus responds. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Maybe a familiar passage to some of you. Here's what I love about it. The question that Jesus answers is essentially, what's the main thing? What is the main thing for us? And brothers and sisters, we have missed this over and over and over again. We have missed where Jesus told us in plain, simple language exactly what the main thing is. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And it turns out Jesus also borrowed material because he borrowed that from Deuteronomy chapter 6, which says, let me read it for you, because I want you to see, this isn't just Jesus making stuff up on the spot. This has been God's plan from the beginning. So we go all the way back to Deuteronomy 6, a passage that for Jews is incredibly important and for followers of Jesus ought to be incredibly important as well. It's a passage called the Shema. It's a famous prayer. Here's how it begins. It says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your minds. And he goes on to say, teach this to your children. Raise your children up with this commitment. The Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. When Jesus is asked, what's the main thing? He turns backward in time to Deuteronomy, to a passage that was written 1,000 years before he was talking to this Pharisee. And he says, yes, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And he says the second is like it. He gave him a 2-for-1. I love it. It's a twofer. Because he answered not only what's the most important, he answered what's the second most important, because the two go together. And he says, love your neighbor as yourself. Again, Jesus didn't make that up. Sometimes I forget that. Jesus didn't make that up. If you go back to Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, you'll read, love your neighbor as yourself. It's been there from the beginning. The main thing, the core thing, the most important thing for followers of God, for the people of God, for believers in Christ has always been, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And let's be clear on the kind of love that we're talking about. And we'll go back to Matthew 22 for this. So sometimes when we hear Jesus say, love God and love your neighbor, we translate that, perhaps not consciously, but subconsciously, we translate that to mean, okay, have good feelings about God and have at least neutral emotions towards your neighbor. This is what we mean by love your neighbor. At least don't hate them. The problem with that is that the word that's found in this text in Greek, and some of you, if you've been in church for a long time, you've heard this, allow yourself to rediscover. If you're new to this conversation, pay very close attention. The word for love in love God and love neighbor in this case is not an emotionally driven word like we often think of it. It is an action-oriented word. That word in Greek is the root word is agape, and it is a self-sacrificing, action-oriented word. It's the kind of thing that means take responsibility for the people around you. It's the kind of thing that means don't just think good things about God or believe good things about your neighbor, but do good things for God, do good things for your neighbor. Love them with everything that you have and everything that you are. It is an action-oriented word. There is no world in which this means sit back on the sidelines and have neutral feelings towards your neighbor while they suffer. There is no world in which this means go to Bible study, pray all you want, do the things that we usually think about in terms of loving God, but then just live your life the same way that you always have and never engage your neighbors. There is no world in which we can hear Jesus say the most important thing, the main commandment, the most important law is to love God and love your neighbor. There is no world in which we can hear that and remain unchanged. And if we have, and we haven't heard the word. Paul, let me just give you one more. Paul goes on to double down on it. In Galatians chapter 5, if you want to read along with me, in Galatians chapter 5, listen to what Paul says because he doubles down on it. This is in Galatians 5, verse 13. He says, but through love become slaves or servants to one another. For the whole law is summed up in a single commandment. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. You cannot love God without loving your neighbor. You cannot love your neighbor well in the manner in which God intends us without loving God as well. You cannot separate the two. Paul doubles down on it and says the whole thing is summed up in love your neighbor as yourself. I want to say two things that are tricky. Two things that are tricky about this. For some of us, in the current climate, when we hear people start saying things like, just love God and love neighbor, it's not that complicated. When we hear that, we start to add some political baggage on top of it. We start to add some tribal language on top of it. And you might think either that's not going far enough or that's going too far. Friends, remove the political tribal language from it and just hear what Jesus has to say. Just hear what Paul has to say. Just hear what the Holy Spirit is speaking to you in this moment through these words. The second thing that I want to say to you is what Paul says next, because look out. It says this, if, however, Paul has just said the whole law is summed up. Love your neighbor as yourself. If, however, you bite and devour one another, take care that you are not consumed by one another. Holy smokes. Paul knew what he was talking about. Yet again, we see the world is not so different now than it was 2,000 years ago, because we continue to consume one another. Whether you're our neighbor or not, we consume each other. We bite and devour one another. I love this. If you bite and devour one another, he says, take care, watch out, look out. You will be consumed by it. This, friends, is what we're going to spend a few weeks working through. What if, when Jesus says, love your neighbor, what if he meant your actual neighbor? Typically in the church for the last, 150 years, when we hear these words, love your neighbor, we think of our neighbor across an ocean or on a different continent. And the church in America has done incredible work, sending missionaries out all over the world, doing incredible things in the name of Christ. But over time, we have done so while sacrificing the most plain meaning, the plainest meaning of what Jesus has to say. What if when Jesus says, love your neighbor, he means your actual physical neighbor? Friends, we have made this whole following Jesus thing so complicated, so complex. And that makes it inaccessible for those who are outside the church and deeply confusing for those inside the church. When we make Jesus, when we start piling on thing after thing on thing and following Jesus, when we make it that complex, even within the church, we get confused. Well, what am I supposed to do then? If I believe in Jesus, then what am I supposed to do? The beauty of this, the genius of what Jesus has to say, is the simplicity of it. Not saying it's easy, but I am suggesting it's far simpler than we've made it in the church in America for the last 100 years, give or take. So, the implications of this, I think, are extraordinary. When we forget this, which I think you can make an argument that we have, when we forget the plain meaning of Jesus' commandment, here's what happens. We don't connect to our neighbors, right? We don't have a relationship with our neighbors, which drives a basic sense of misunderstanding. You cannot understand that which you don't engage with. And that misunderstanding creates a petri dish of fear. And that fear explodes into anger. I would suggest there might be some analysis that's as good as that, but I don't know if you can analyze our culture better than that right now. We are isolated from one another, which means we misunderstand each other, and so we become afraid of each other, and that explodes in rage. It explodes in anger. Whether you're talking about online or in the car where the guy in front of you stops short, you give him a little honk, he starts taking his seatbelt off. I'm not talking about a real life event in my life. And he starts to get out of the car, and what is he going to do? Fight you? That's where we are, because we are not connected to our neighbors anymore. We have forgotten the most basic commandment of Jesus' ministry: love God and love your neighbor. On the other hand, when we foster those kinds of relationships, when we build that kind of connection with the people next door, then suddenly we understand them just a little bit better. And that increase in understanding decreases our level of fear, right? Because if I understand you a little bit better, then I'm not as afraid of what I don't know about you or don't like about you. If I understand you a little bit better, that fear is decreased, and as fear diminishes, anger dissipates. And suddenly we're able to be the men and women that God made us to be for our neighbors. Add friends has to change how we live our lives on a daily basis. The thing that God's been chasing the entire time is the transformation of the world around us. The redemption, the renewal, the recreation of the world around us. That's what he's been chasing the entire time. And the truth is, government programs aren't the solution to our social challenges. They can help and they can hurt, but they aren't the ultimate solution. And the same thing is true of the police, and the same thing is true of schools, the same thing is true of church programs, the same thing is true of preachers, the same thing is true of getting more people in church. None of those things are the solution that God has provided for the world that He created and the world that He continues to love. The solution for all of them, the solution to our social challenges, the solution for the transformation of the world is you. It is us. It's we. We're it. We're the solution. If we will simply follow the plainest meaning of what Jesus has to say and love our God and love our neighbor. Can't do one without the other. I'll close with this. As that conversation that I was telling you about earlier, as it progressed, eventually one of the assistant city managers pipes up and says that in their engagement with the community, there is no discernible difference. This is a gut punch. Just get ready for it. There is no discernible difference from the city's perspective between the way that Christians and non-Christians neighbor in the city. There is no discernible difference in the way a Christian shows up as a neighbor and the way a non-Christian shows up as a neighbor. That's an outsider's perspective that is powerful in its indictment. And I wonder if that's true here in Peachtree City. I wonder if there is a difference between the way you and I engage our neighbors here and the way the non-Christians around us engage their neighbors. I wonder if that is true in your neighborhood. I wonder if where you live, if you neighbor any differently than the folks who have no relationship with God. I wonder if it is true in our own homes. Is there a discernible difference between the way we followers of Jesus listen and respond to Jesus' command to love our neighbors and the way the world does the opposite? That's where we're going to spend some time trying to figure out. Do we hear? Can we respond?